Like, I would have thought that censorship hinders progression.
Oh, I do, YouTube. No, and that's a whole other. Censorship is the single greatest threat to the West today, I would say. And for China, they justified it as preserving certain unique cultural traditions that they didn't want to by exposing the Chinese people to these perverted foreign ideas, they could undermine the harmony that exists in Chinese culture. And of course, it's all lies, but that is the rationale they give. In the West, we're in danger of doing the same thing, right? So, and this is something that has become a partisan issue. So conservatives, those on the right, tend to be more pro-free speech than people on the left. And this is unfortunate because on the left, every progressive idea has started out as a minority viewpoint, right? Like the fact that we have gay rights today, Oscar Wilde was thrown in prison, okay, for being gay. That's not that long ago, okay, in the course of human culture. And so it's only by a minority viewpoint that a lot of people find being offensive, having the opportunity to have their say and to argue their case, and for people to kind of wrestle with that marketplace of ideas that you can actually bring about progressive change. So it is only because of this really perverted alignment, which is absolutely temporary, between big tech and a certain school of progressive ideology that's prevalent in, say, Silicon Valley, that says, okay, we have to censor all these voices we don't like because we think they're harmful, and they call them, I don't know, alt-right or fascists or whatever, which is, none of this is true, but it is convenient to push a particular ideological viewpoint. And the problem is, it hurts even that particular viewpoint, because the way to get better in your own views is to be challenged, and good ideas don't become good by suppressing all other ideas. Good ideas become good by competing with bad ideas. Okay, and so you do need to be able to discuss even highly controversial, even offensive issues without fear of persecution, right? And that's what it is. And if you persecute someone, you actually give them a legitimacy that they often don't deserve. There's even Holocaust denial, right? Which is like a proven historical fact, right? I personally, and I know others, even Jewish people that are against persecuting legally Holocaust deniers, right? So obviously in Germany you can't do it, in Israel you can't do it, in Austria you can't do it. A few places you can't deny the Holocaust existed. But if you actually prosecute those people and throw them in jail and silence them, then it leaves a lot of other people wondering why you had the need to do that, right? And you give them a certain degree. I mean, I remember when this is getting into the sort of the darkest ideas, when I first read Mein Kampf when I was 11 years old at the library. I remember going to the library and I was like thinking that I was going to get some dark knowledge, right? Yeah. Because everyone wanted to be quiet about the whole like Nazi regime, and therefore, and I had this burning question, which was like, okay, Germany is this like modern society, serious Western country. How was it that they were so beguiled by this individual and this ideology that they were willing to wage a world war and persecute an entire group of people? And the fact whenever I ask anyone about it, they just, brush me off as a kid. There must be something to this, Anyway, I went and read the book, and nothing turned me into a greater anti-Nazi heretic than Mein Kampf. It was just the most painful read and it created a lot more questions than it answered, which was, how could the German people be so stupid as to be persuaded by what was, even internally, even taking it at face value without even particularly criticizing the content, even internally wasn't consistent or logically, presented. And so that incoherence made me realize that that the whole concept of racial superiority and so on was just a fundamental absurdity, and it was exposure to that idea that persuaded me of that, right? And so, you know, now, okay, I'm just one person, that's just one anecdote, but I am super pleased. I mean, if I had been prevented throughout my entire life from actually reading the book that Hitler wrote, I'd be asking myself to this day, is there something in that that I don't know, you know? Like, and so we really do need to be exposed to ideas. And what you do with those crazy nuts is not persecute them, but laugh at them, you know, because once you can engage with them in their own way and take it to their logical conclusion, then these things become pretty ridiculous.
And I think also, like, having an opposing view, something that's so radical as, you know, race superiority, there shows some truth into the fear between countries, I guess, and that's what stimulated the war. I don't know, like, it's an interesting one. Censorship is a very interesting concept because on one hand, I feel like I am a leftist. And like I care for the minority groups, and I really just want to empower as many people as possible. But then you can't, like, you have a fair point. You can't, you know, in order to win, you can't suppress the other side. You honestly have to debate and stimulate new ideas. And once you go into debate, it stimulates more problems. Which, yeah, I don't know. I find that when I don't know. I want to know your opinion. Like, why isn't there more? I'm finding that there is a lack of this openness to debate from both sides. It seems like there is like this shut it out mentality, you know, censor it, rather than having an honest discussion with opposing ideas and views. Maybe it's because it's just a challenging one. People just don't want to be proven wrong, or like proven wrong of whatever worldview that they have.
Well, that's, I mean, the question about why does censorship exist, particularly in a free society, supposedly, is that people are afraid that certain ideas are harmful. That speech is dangerous, and that is a fundamentally incorrect idea, right?
Like, I say rubbish all the time.
Yeah, yes, and but there is but it is dangerous if you're trying to preserve a dogma, right? Because then you have heretics, okay? And so if what you are trying to do is impose a set of presuppositions on society, having people question them is a threat to the imposed ideology. It's not a threat to human culture, it's a threat to your own particular worldview. I mean, if we think about what are the prevalent ideologies, that is, and I would describe an ideology as a value explaining an effect, right? So let's say you walk into a room and see a group of people, and a man tells a woman to sit down and be quiet, right? If you came in with, say, a intersectional ideology, you might go, well, this is like heteronormative patriarchy at work, and he's telling her to sit down and be quiet because she's a woman, and blah, blah, blah. That's fine. Or if you had a fundamental Christian ideology, you might walk in and say, okay, well, they're obviously either married, or he's the priest, or like, you would explain what you are seeing with a low resolution of information based upon your heuristic of your ideology, right? Now, if you thought that ideology was the only ideology that had validity in society and that everything else was a threat to that ideology, then of course you're going to suppress alternative explanations for things, right? And so where I find it being, like, it's particularly censorious on the left, because in the left there are certain ideologies that are more powerful and require that level of control. I mean, and then taking a step back, the right has been a lot more successful, right? If you think about it, than the left over the past few years. So you had Brexit and a crushing victory from Boris Johnson in the UK. You had Scott Morrison winning an unwinnable election here in Australia, absolutely annihilating the Labor Party. You had Donald Trump elected in the United States. And so what is the explanation for that? Now, if you're on the left in a particular ideology, it's, alt-right actors and Russian bots and things like that. It's information or misinformation that is leading to this unspeakable crime of popular so-called being democratically elected. Okay, that's one explanation. Okay, another explanation could be that those people are better at speaking to the electorate, right? And perhaps people don't necessarily believe in this ideology that is being pushed on them, but you don't know it because people yell into their echo chambers on Facebook or whatever, and they speak to people that think the same way. And then if people who don't agree with them, they don't say anything about it. They just keep their mouth shut. But when it comes to the ballot box, they do express their view, right? But they're afraid of speaking out because of this culture of censorship. And so if they didn't have this culture of censorship, let's say you did have an ideology that you thought was the best thing for society, and I'm not prejudging these ideologies at this point, but if you did have that, then the best thing you could do is try and get them to come out of the woodwork and explain why they have a different view, and either you educate them and try and persuade them to your point of view, or you modify your ideology in the face of compelling alternative perspectives. And therefore, that's how society progresses. I mean, the test that I apply to YouTube, and YouTube is actually going a really dark path, but it's a whole other conversation, we can talk about that, is the Hannah Arendt test.
The what?
Right? The Hannah Arendt test. It's something I've come up with, okay?
Okay.
So whose side, if Hannah Arendt or Galileo, I think, but Hannah Arendt I think is a better situation. Hannah Arendt is, in my view, and not even probably that controversial, the most influential political theorist of the 20th century. Incredible philosopher, right? She wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism and more famously The Banality of Evil, covering the Eichmann trials. So she's a Jewish woman herself, lots of deep connections to Israel, but came out of the Eichmann trials and wrote an essay in the New Yorker, back when the New Yorker was a good, hallowed institution as opposed to the kind of rag it is today, the Banality of Evil, which basically said that for evil to prevail, you don't need to have a Mephistopheles, right? You can have very, very mediocre people thinking they're doing the right thing, just focusing on their task, without any personal malice, but without any moral self-awareness. Okay, there's a whole other story. But the thing is, when it came out, it offended everybody because the Eichmann trial. So Eichmann was the guy who ran the trains on the camps, right? The Israelis captured him and put him on trial. And the reason they did this big public trial was to try and put a lot of the blame on particular individuals. Now, that's a whole other topic of history, and I won't get into it here, but basically Hannah Arendt kind of shot that through and said, look, he's actually a really boring individual. He's not a great guy and he deserved what he got, right? But he was just, there wasn't anything impressive about him as this sort of demonic figure, right? You should see the video of him. He is incredibly mediocre. And and she wrote this, but she wrote not only explaining that, but also why, how these things happen. What is it about human condition that can allow such a thing to eventuate? How one can actually participate in these horrible crimes without necessarily feeling anything about it, and it really changed the way the whole world saw this particular issue, and has shaped our thinking since. Now, she's mandatory reading in any political theory class, right? She's a great thinker, and there was a great movie about her and the controversy it created, I think, just called Arendt. You should look it up. And my question for YouTube would be, and other mainstream media organisations, is if Hannah Arendt was around today, would her work have been published, right? There's not a snowball's chance in hell, right? Because like it would have upset too many people, and people would have called for her to be cancelled and run out of town, and all her social media would have been shut down, and then in the press, everything that she'd written would have been taken out of context and misrepresented to the point where everyone just like that is the world we live in today. Even though her understanding of the human condition is such that has actually matured our thinking about the world, thanks to her insights. So that's why I'm really nervous about it. Like the YouTube censors all kinds of stuff. So at the moment, they're censoring anything about COVID that doesn't align with WHO guidelines, right? Mm-hmm. So if someone has a particular viewpoint about the nature, the effectiveness of lockdowns, or the potential treatments and things like that, they shut that down completely. Now, I don't personally agree with a lot of the stuff that people say, right? Mm. But if it's said in good faith, then it should be allowed, because then you can have that debate, right? Mm. And you have to trust the general community about, to be able to make that distinction.
That's
people
are
not
stupid. Like, is the general community educated enough to critique
What do you guys think, people? Yeah.
Like the general public, because people are living in the situation with COVID, people are living in a world of fear, and they'll do anything in their power to, protect themselves. We saw with hydroxychloroquine when President Trump just came out. You pronounced
that really well. Go on.
Oh, did I? Okay, there you go. When President Trump talked about the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine, so. Yeah, and there are advantages with some censorship in terms of spreading misinformation that is harmful. That's the whole point of censorship, right? Is the idea of preventing harm. Yes, there is other.
Here's where I think the line should be. Okay. The number one rule for me is it said in good faith? So, for example, I don't believe tobacco companies should be able to put out messaging everywhere saying cigarettes are good for you, okay? Mm-hmm. Because they know full well that that's not true, and they're only doing it to profit from the harm that that's creating, right? So that is clear cut. So if someone says something that they know isn't true in order to be malicious or to gain something that is different from what they're actually saying, then I think that should be censored. I think it should be censored if people are calling for violence or doing other things that are clearly illegal. That would be illegal in normal life, right? So if you're calling for everyone to break the law, unless it's an act of actual political rebellion, right? So Chinese law maybe doesn't count, but just generally, doing things that are harming other people, then sure. If you're calling for people to commit terrorist acts and bomb abortion clinics or whatever, then yes, you should be censored. And that's really about it.
But should you censor tobacco companies touting about having a smoke-free world with e-cigarettes rather than...
Well, yeah, it's just because someone says something self-serving doesn't mean it should be censored. Because when you censor, there is a transaction cost, right? First of all, you have to decide who has the right to make that call, right? How is that decision going to be challenged? What natural justice does the person who's been censored then have to appeal? And the people that are deprived of that information, what actions are they likely to take if they feel like they're not getting the full story? So, sure, tobacco companies are touting e-cigarettes as the future. But there is a legitimate debate about e-cigarettes, right? I don't approve of people pushing e-cigarettes in places where there isn't smoking, right? So I think in Australia we could probably do without e-cigarettes because Australia doesn't have much smoking compared to the rest of the world anymore. And therefore, but if it is going to replace smoking in places of which smoking is prevalent, is that undesirable? I don't have an answer to that question, by the way. That is a question that is worthy of debate. And just because the tobacco companies have an obvious interest, that interest should be declared. That shouldn't exclude them from debate. No, but that is something. If someone has a clear bias, a reason for putting forward a point of view, then that should be disclosed. Like I very much believe in like foreign interest registers and all those kinds of things, so that people can, when people are saying something, people know where they're coming from, right? So those politically affiliated think tanks, when they get on TV and like, there's nothing wrong with that, but they should be clear to the audience that these are not, dispassionate observers. These are people pushing a particular point of view. And as long as that's disclosed, then it's fine. So more transparency, not less censorship, not more. If you do all of that right, then you end up getting us. And I keep coming back to this Hannah Arendt thing. Like I'd be willing for 100 or 1,000 people to sprout absolute nonsense and occasionally, some harm resulting from that, than to have one Hannah Arendt not contribute to the human race. Like it's that cost is just too great.